Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. It is a holiday week, but we couldn't let you go without getting a little podcast in your feed, and especially with all the news that the New York Jets make on a regular basis, it felt wrong to ignore them this week, Greg.
Well,
Especially
one
since
person in particular, I guess, more than others.
not everybody has the luxury of taking a quick trip to Egypt over mandatory minicamp, but that's not what we're here to discuss with Aaron Rodgers
No.
and the New York Jets. It is a fascinating football team, though, for a great many reasons, Greg. More so, I think, because you and I have talked about the idea of Aaron Rodgers is the offense there. And when he experienced the injury, unfortunate, so early on in the season, 4 plays rather, into their 2023 campaign, things really went downhill fast for Zach Wilson and that group. So now that Aaron Rodgers expects to be back, well, I guess let's just start with your general thoughts on the New York Jets before we talk about more of what they've added.
I mean, defensively, they're a really good team. We'll get to that in a sec, because they are very, very good. And a lot of that's kind of been lost in translation because of Aaron Rodgers. So let's start with Rodgers, because the reality is the other stuff doesn't matter to me at all. We're talking football. You can make the argument that he's the best pure passer of a football we've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been a great quarterback his entire career. He's incredibly intelligent. He'll be a first ballot Hall of Famer. So we have to assume that he'll play at a high level. We're not going to sit here and debate, because that's mere speculation, Buck, as you know, as to what level he'll play at. Let's just go with the assumption that he's Aaron Rodgers, which is a really, really high level player who changes everything about an offense.
Yes, and certainly with the Jets, it didn't seem, and I can't speak to the coaching staff, but the contingency plan in the absence of Aaron Rodgers was certainly not effective. And you and I have talked about Zach Wilson before. He obviously moves on to the Denver Broncos in this situation, and they bring in Tyrod Taylor as the backup quarterback. But the Aaron Rodgers skill set, Greg, when you talk about being one of the best pure passers and arguably one of the best pure passers that we've ever seen. What is it about his skill set that lends itself to that kind of efficiency? He doesn't seem to like to play under center that often, or at least in recent memory, it seems that that's been a more comfort level thing for him to operate out of the shotgun. But what is it about Aaron Rodgers that makes him that kind of skilled player?
Well, there's so many factors that make a quarterback great, but I think you start with the fact that he's a power thrower with incredibly precise ball location. And those two things don't often go together. There's been guys throughout the league over time, like Troy Aikman was like that. Carson Palmer was like that. You certainly could argue that Mahomes is in that category, although Mahomes, obviously, one of the things that truly makes him special is his ability to extend and make plays outside of the structure of the offense, which Rodgers in his younger days could do really well. Doesn't do that the same way he did, 5-10 years ago. But you don't often see power throwers. And he's an odd kind of power thrower because his delivery is so compact. But his ball location has been just incredibly precise. I mean, ridiculously so. And when you talk to coaches, while they might have, 15 sets of traits for a quarterback, which they all do when they evaluate quarterbacks, when all's said and done, they come down to 2 things. They come down to decision-making and accuracy. And accuracy is more about precise ball location. And Rodgers is a master at both of those things. And, he's just a really high level player, and he's been doing it for a long time.
Certainly. So often when you and I talk about the construction of these teams and the genesis of the coaches and where they come from, you use the phrase often, coaches coach against coaches. In a situation with Nathaniel Hackett and Aaron Rodgers, the Nathaniel Hackett Aaron Rodgers experience was one of the biggest reasons why Hackett ends up in New York after working with him in Green Bay. Are there any defining qualities of a Nathaniel Hackett offense outside of what Aaron Rodgers brings to the table? Because I know this kind of separating those two is a little more complicated.
Well, in all honesty, when you're dealing with an Aaron Rodgers, and I remember a coach who'd been in the league for years and years telling me this about Peyton Manning, when you're dealing with Aaron Rodgers, with his experience and his intelligence, I had one of his former coaches, quarterback coaches, coordinators tell me that he's never seen any quarterback with the intelligence of Rodgers and his ability to sort of see things on the field, that he just sees more than any other quarterback that this coach had been around. So essentially, when you have this kind of quarterback, you're working to what he does. In other words, you're kind of, and I'm not saying this sarcastically at all, you're running his offense. You're running what he's comfortable with. And you work to him, and that's, look, I'm not suggesting that Nathaniel Hackett's not going to have things he wants to do, but obviously they know each other, because they've worked together before. So ultimately, you're working through what Aaron Rodgers is most comfortable with in given situations. So you're really running his offense, and what as I said, what makes him comfortable. So it's really not, hey, they're bringing in a coach, and of course Hackett was there last year. They're not bringing in a coach, to say, okay, we're going to run my offense now. That's not happening. It's essentially going to be Aaron Rodgers' offense.
So when we talk about the things that make that Aaron Rodgers is comfortable with, or the places where Rodgers in particular excels, when you break him down, Greg, and I know obviously last year's sample size is not viable with literally four plays, but where is Aaron Rodgers at his most comfortable? Where do you see him excel the most in certain concepts?
Well, I would answer it that this way. I think it comes down with Aaron Rodgers because he can essentially do anything. I think now you're getting into specific situational football. So people understand, in every situation, there's not 50 plays that a coordinator or a quarterback's choosing from. I mean, I remember having a great conversation with Carson Palmer a number of years ago, because I knew him pretty well, and just talking about, hey, when it's 3rd and 6+, how many plays are you potentially expecting? He said, oh, only 4 or 5. He said that's the way it works in any given situation. You're only working from a select group that you've practiced all week. You can't practice 1,000 plays,
Right.
So essentially it comes down to situational football, since Rodgers can be really good at pretty much anything. So now you base it on the opponent. So now you know that a certain opponent on 3rd and 6+ likes to do these 2 things. That's sort of what they do as their staples. So we're going to percentage-wise attack those 2 things with our potential play calls. And there's maybe 5 concepts that you're choosing from. And the only difference is now you get into what personnel are you putting out there and what are the formations. But the pass game concepts, those don't change.
Yeah.
It's just how you run those. You can run concepts from different looks, but the concepts are the concepts, and there's not 1,000 of those.
Right. They are the Titans' home opener opponent, as a matter of fact, this year. So it's going to be interesting to see.
Is that week 3?
That's week 2. So the Titans will open on the road against the Chicago Bears and then come home to host the Jets. So what one would assume that Aaron Rodgers would be available by then. But this team and in its construction, Greg, this is very much, all in around Aaron Rodgers or nothing. And we'll talk about the defense here in just a second. But the offensive talent that they have added on top of what they already have in Mike Williams, the former Chargers wide receiver, and Tyron Smith, the left tackle, formerly of the Cowboys, 2 players who have had injuries in their past, but have been quality players throughout the course of their NFL career. You add that to the mix with one of the more talented wide receivers that we have seen in the last couple of years coming out of Ohio State. And I'm blanking on the name, actually.
Garrett Wilson.
And Garrett Wilson. Thank you, Greg. Garrett Wilson, who has always been an exceptional player. When you watch Garrett Wilson, where is it that his skill set brings out that level of greatness? What do you like when you break down the Garrett Wilson tape?
Garrett Wilson is one of those receivers that essentially can do anything. He's super quick as a route runner, naturally quick, understands how to run routes. Therefore, he can separate. He can separate and win at the top of his route stem. He can win against man coverage. You can line him up anywhere in the formation. And that's critical here because Mike Williams, assuming health, that's a big thing with Mike Williams. Mike Williams is more of a stereotypical X receiver, meaning he will line up to the short side of the field on the ball. He's 6'4". He runs well. Let's assume he still runs well after all the injuries, which means Garrett Wilson will likely be more of a movement receiver, which really fits what he does. You can get him free access off the ball. You can get him quickly into his routes, and he's so fluid and so smooth. And like I said, he just knows how to separate. They drafted Malachi Corley to ideally be their third receiver. Of course, we don't know that yet because he's a rookie. But, they also have a good run game. And they have Breece Hall, who's a very good back and is big enough to be a foundation back. And then they drafted Braylon Allen out of Wisconsin, who I don't think he runs, and this surprised me when I watched his tape. I didn't think he ran as powerfully as his size indicates, but he is a big back, and he's built like Tarzan. The key thing here is the O-line. Yeah. Signing Tyron Smith to play left tackle, Morgan Moses, an overlooked player here because of Tyron Smith, who's actually been a very good right tackle over the last number of years. So they needed to shore up their offensive line because that's been a bit of an issue the last couple of years.
Yeah, certainly. Beyond just the Zach Wilson situation, adding, as you said, those players, and in addition, John Simpson, the guard, is how they're looking to fortify that offensive line group. On the other side of the ball, we know Robert Saleh comes from the San Francisco 49ers, the former defensive coordinator. He brings that system over to the New York Jets in his tenure while he's been the head coach of the New York Jets. C.J. Mosley has been a very high-level player for a long time, it feels like, not just for the Jets, but even before that for the Ravens, and the way that they operate that system. It's tough. We've talked about this with the Titans too, Greg. Anytime, no matter how successful you are defensively, when you can't score, everything is magnified and everything feels just a little bit worse. But this was a defense that has quality throughout, and the system itself seems to really lend that to maximizing the ability of the players that they have there.
Yeah, and you make a great point about the defense. When you can't score, it just seems like every play becomes so important. But this is a really, really good defense. They have a lot of really good players. I mean, you mentioned C.J. Mosley. The other linebacker, Quinnen Williams, is an explosive player. He had a terrific year a year ago, and he's the one they use when they blitz. They're not a high-percentage blitz defense, but when they blitz, Quinnen Williams is often the blitzer, and he's an explosive athlete. They signed Hassan Reddick, or they traded for him, I guess. And he can rush the quarterback, but they've got Quinnen Williams inside, probably one of the 3 or 4 best interior tackles in the league. And Jermaine Johnson, going into his 3rd year out of Florida State, originally was a big recruit at Georgia, transferred to Florida State. This guy is really, really a good player. I mean, he is big, athletic, physical, nasty. This is a really good front. I mean, and then you go to the back end, Sauce Gardner, one of the best corners in the league. He's not really a matchup corner. They have not played that way. A lot of people, when the schedule comes out, I see a lot of people with the Jets. Well, who's Sauce Gardner going to match up to? Week 1, he's going to do this guy. Week 4, they don't play that way. He's the left corner. DJ Reed's the right corner. Very rarely do they match up Sauce Gardner. Now, having said that, could they change, this year? Of course they could, but that's not what's been the case in his first 2 years in the league. He's played one side. DJ Reed, who's been very good as well, has played the other side.
Quinnen Williams, as you mentioned, one of the 3 or 4 best interior defensive linemen in the sport. What kind of separates or distinguishes Quinnen Williams' skill set from some of the other guys that we talk about? For example, Jeffrey Simmons, Chris Jones are usually mentioned at the top of that list. What is it that makes Quinnen Williams such an effective player from the interior?
I think Williams, just in terms of pure quickness, is quicker than those players. His game's a little different. Not that he can't play with any power at all. I don't want to say that, because he can. But he's a quickness player. When you think of a Jeffrey Simmons, we've spoken about him for years, and he certainly fits in that category of one of the 3 or 4 or 5 best. There's a group there. You can order them any way you want. Simmons is country strong. We've seen that, again, not to say that he can't win at times with quickness, but his game, the foundation of Jeffrey Simmons' game, as Tennessee fans knows, is that he's just a country strong man. Williams, I would say the foundation of his game is more based on quickness and athleticism than it is power, even though he can win that way on occasion. So that's more of what he is.
Yeah. The AFC East is just going to be, and I know we have one more team to talk about in the AFC East before we move on from the division entirely, but like the Jets' place in that division this year and the matchups that are going to result out of that from seeing these opponents twice a year. I mean, they're one of the more interesting, beyond the TMZ element, they're one of the more football interesting teams, I think, in the sport this year, Greg.
I mean, if Rodgers is healthy and still plays at a high level, and there's nothing to suggest he won't, then they could be a really, really good team. I mean, because like we said, they really upgraded the O-line. They have they have Breece Hall, and we'll see about Braylon Allen, but so let's say they have two good running backs. Hall will be the number one back, clearly. Their defense is going to be really good. So this is going to be a tough team to play against. I mean, they could be a really, really good team.
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly the expectation for Jets fans, one of the most long-suffering fan bases in the National Football League. And we'll see what happens with the Jets once we start to get into the thick of things. When next we get together, we'll be talking about the New England Patriots, and we'll put a bow on the AFC East that way. Another team going through a variety of different changes this offseason. So I'm looking forward to that conversation then. Greg, have a great 4th of July, and I appreciate your time as always, my friend.
Thanks, Buck. Appreciate it. Talk to you next week.